Over the years, I've thought and been asked this question a couple times. We're talking about Baptist history, and we've been spending a lot of time on the formation of our country recently when we talk about the miracles in American history. And one thought that has occurred to people, and even myself, was why was there was there a Baptist leader, an individual man or a Baptist pastor that was a leader in the formation of our country? The answer is there were none. In the sense, if you think of like a George Washington or a Thomas Jefferson, there was nobody like that was a Baptist. There were no Baptists at the Constitutional Convention that I know of. And so it's primarily true that there was no Baptist individual leader like that, as you might wonder about. But there's a reason for that. And I wanted to talk about this morning. I thought it'd be a great day to talk about that, Baptists and patriotism, and on a patriotic day. And so we want to talk about that. And as I said, we have talked a lot about the Puritans and the Pilgrims and the formation of the country. We have spent time on that era, and I don't want to be boring this morning. I don't want to put you to sleep, but I thought it'd be fun just to talk through this. And so, if you remember, America was primarily settled by Puritans who left England, who wanted to. The term Puritan comes from the idea they were dissatisfied with the Church of England. They wanted to purify the Church of England, so they were outcasts in England, and they were provided a way to come to America to, in a sense, establish the Church of England in America. That's really a broad brush, but that's kind of what it was. And so they came to America, and essentially the Congregational Church is the American Church of England, and they tried to purify what they thought was wrong, and the Church of England had left its Bible teaching, and there was corruption, and they wanted to fix that, but stay within that context of a church, and they came to America, and so they established a state church here in America, and they dreamed of a state church with the state being governed by religious authorities. And what's interesting is they had great intentions, and one of the great ironies of history is the very thing they left England over, they became over here, just in a very few short years. They became a state church, and there began to be corruption, and we'll talk a little bit about that, but it's very, very interesting what happened to them. But Baptist churches, in a sense, or Baptists in America, kind of grew out of this environment where religious freedom didn't exist in most colonies. As Pastor Volgan said, I think recently, the Puritans believed in freedom of religion as long as it was their religion and their specific sect, But if you believed anything else, there was no freedom of religion. And so there's a distinction, and we have to know that. And so Baptists kind of grew out of that environment where religious freedom really didn't exist in most areas in most of the colonies. And so because of this, they were not allowed places of prominence. And so there were never national Baptist leaders, but there were pastors and individual laymen in local churches. And I think part of that was our Baptist forefathers. They were grateful, or they considered themselves very fortunate for any liberties they were granted to freely worship, and they didn't want to draw attention to themselves by having a person out front that was making a lot of noise. And so, however, as the Bible says, the light cannot be hidden under a bushel very long, and Baptists began to grow and attract attention. And if you remember, in the 1700s, over 50 Baptists in the state of Virginia, in the colony of Virginia, Baptist preachers were thrown into prison in the mid and late 1700s. If you remember, we just talked about Dr. John Clark, and Dr. John Clark, for all practical purposes, established the first Baptist church in America. And he and one of his deacons, he had a deacon named Obadiah Holmes. And Obadiah Holmes, if you remember the story, we told the story a couple of years ago, a very, very famous story, of course, in American history and in Baptist history, was beaten almost to death by the Massachusetts Bay officials for having the audacity to have a church service in Massachusetts that wasn't the state church. And so Obadiah Holmes didn't talk about this last time we talked about John Clark, but when John Clark went to England to get the charter for Rhode Island, the church there in Rhode Island called Obadiah Holmes to be the pastor while Dr. Clark was in England. And so we have those Baptists thrown into prison. We have Obadiah Holmes beaten almost to death. And in every colony, Baptist preachers were mistreated almost continuously. So for that reason, there was never a national Baptist leader. However, when our national forefathers, I'm talking about the colonies, the Continental Congress, when they decided that they were going to push for freedom from England, from foreign oppression, the Baptists as a whole were almost immediate and unanimously in support for the War of Independence. Baptists viewed the Revolution and the war that would follow as almost a providential act to clear the way for freedom of religion. And so they were wholeheartedly for what was about to happen in early American history. They vigorously supported Thomas Jefferson and the Declaration of Independence. Now, Jefferson is a very imperfect man, to put it lightly. But Baptists were wholeheartedly in support of Thomas Jefferson. And here's why. We know that Jefferson, when he did go to church, he went to a Baptist church right near his home. And it was at that Baptist church that he was taught self-government that the New Testament teaches. And he would talk about that. And in the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson says this, that governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. This is true self-government. And now Baptists recognize that the principles of the New Testament were going to be applied to civil government, and they were wholeheartedly behind that. When the Constitution was written, Baptist influence was there, was strongly felt, because again, they felt that this was a chance to assure freedom of conscience, and that would be included in the Constitution. If you remember, the First Amendment to the Bill of Rights would be written primarily because of the cloud of Baptists, and specifically because of the leadership of one Baptist pastor, John Leland. It is safe to say, and many historians say this, that if it wasn't for John Leland, we wouldn't have the First Amendment to the Constitution. Pretty interesting thought. So that Baptist pastor, very influential, if not the influence, on getting the First Amendment to the Bill of Rights. And so Baptists, realizing that the principles their forefathers had lived and died for, they supported the Declaration, they supported the war, they supported the Continental Congress, they supported eventually the Constitution. But I'm going somewhere with this. It's important to understand that Baptists were never primarily politically oriented, and that was on purpose. They knew that politics and religion don't mix. It's Roger Williams' famous quote. And Roger Williams said, when you mix politics and religion, you get politics. And very interesting quote. And so the Baptists are, to use a term I don't use very much, but our worldview is different. We didn't and don't want a theocracy as the Puritans wanted. Our primary push is evangelistic. So we believe that personal salvation and showing people the way of salvation is the primary means of furthering the will of God. So rather than envisioning a millennial kingdom as the Puritans did, established by political means, we believe that our primary push of individuals and local churches should be preaching the gospel to the world. And so this is why Baptists would flourish under this American dream of total freedom of religion. And even when Baptists were in the majority, as they were in Rhode Island, they never tried to impose their doctrine on the general population. It was very important for them to understand the way that God worked, and he did not work through a state church. But Baptists have always been very patriotic. And here's some fun facts, and you might remember some of these, but there was never a lack of patriotism, as I talked about, the influences there. Samuel Francis Smith, a Baptist young man studying for the ministry, he wrote the hymn, the patriotic hymn, America. The choir will sing that later this morning. And America almost became our national anthem, very, very second only in popularity to our national anthem. Another fact, in 1892, President Benjamin Harrison, he made a national appeal, a national request. He said, let the national flag float over every schoolhouse in the country, and the exercises be such as shall impress upon our youth the patriotic duties of American citizenship. And in response to that request from the president, a young Baptist preacher named Francis Bellamy, he wrote the Pledge of Allegiance. And that, if you think about it, the Pledge of Allegiance has been etched into the minds of hundreds of millions of people. And that was written by a Baptist preacher, Francis Bellamy. And of course, Baptists have always fought for these ideals that America has given us. They fought shoulder to shoulder with men and women of every religious persuasion to keep alive this American dream. A great peril. I think of, this is kind of off the subject, but a Baptist missionary, John Birch, became one of the great heroes of World War II and eventually was martyred for the Lord. But the influence there of Baptists throughout our history. So the answer to the question is, why were there no individual Baptists at the forefront as leaders? Well, Bible-believing Baptists have actually been at the forefront, but maybe not in the way we would think. Our influence has been felt primarily personally rather than politically. And it's just something you want to think about and really impress upon us, something we shouldn't forget, that our influence has been felt personally and not politically. And may we never forget that distinction. May our generation, and may we teach the next generation to never forget that, or what our primary purpose is, and not to forget that.